Every American believes they understand. Money. We work, we earn, we spend, we save. The government collects taxes, issues bonds, and pays its bills. Simple, logical, straightforward. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about how money functions in America is built on an illusion? What if the entire system runs on a mechanism so counterintuitive that most people refuse to accept it, even when shown the evidence? The United States government doesn't just spend money or borrow money. It manufactures both money and debt simultaneously in the very same moment through a process so elegant and so unsettling that it makes medieval alchemy look crude. And this isn't some conspiracy theory or fringe economics. This is official policy, documented in federal records, happening right now at a scale that would make your head spin. In fiscal year 2024 alone, the Treasury held nearly 300 auctions and sold more than $8 trillion worth of securities. $8 trillion. That's not a typo. To put that in perspective, it exceeds the entire combined gross domestic product of Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And every single one of those auctions performed the same magic trick, creating money out of thin air while also generating debt obligations that future generations will be responsible for. But here's where things get interesting. The government isn't borrowing from piles of existing cash stored somewhere in bank vaults. It's not like your neighbor lending you $20 from their wallet. When the Treasury sells a bond, it creates new financial assets that didn't exist moments before. And when investors buy those bonds, the money they spend doesn't vanish into some government savings account. It becomes liquid capital that immediately flows into federal spending, funding everything from military payrolls to Medicare benefits to infrastructure projects. This is the machinery that keeps America functioning. And most Americans have never seen it actually operate. So let me show you precisely how the government manufactures money and debt at the same time, why this process is both brilliant and frightening, and what it means for your financial future. The foundation of this system rests on something called Treasury auctions. Picture this: every few days, the United States Treasury announces it needs money. Not because the government is bankrupt, but because it spends more than it collects in taxes every single year. In fiscal 2024, the government spent nearly $7 trillion, but only took in about $4.5 trillion in revenue. That $3.5 trillion gap has to come from somewhere. So the Treasury creates debt instruments, bonds, notes, bills. These are essentially IOUs backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. But here's the crucial point: these IOUs didn't exist before the Treasury created them. They're not certificates tied to gold in a vault or claims on any physical asset. They're promises manufactured from nothing but government authority and investor confidence. When auction day arrives, something remarkable happens. Banks, pension funds, foreign governments, hedge funds, and individual investors sit at computer terminals and Submit bids. They're not bidding on existing assets being resold. They're bidding on freshly created government promises that materialize the moment the Treasury announced the auction. Let's walk through a real example. In October 2024, the Treasury announced a $50 billion 10-year note auction. $50 billion worth of debt that had never existed before suddenly became available to purchase. When the auction closed and the dust settled, investors had committed $50 billion to buy these newly minted government IOUs. But watch what happens next, because this is where the magic occurs. The investors transfer $50 billion into the Treasury's account at the Federal Reserve. That money doesn't vanish. It doesn't get locked in a vault, waiting for some rainy day. It becomes immediate spending power. The Treasury can write checks, fund programs, pay salaries, and purchase goods and services with that $50 billion the very moment the auction settles. Meanwhile, those investors now hold $50 billion worth of Treasury securities. These bonds become assets on their balance sheets. They can trade them, use them as collateral for loans, or simply collect interest for the next decade. The financial system just gained $50 billion in new assets that didn't exist before the auction. So in a single transaction, the government created $50 billion in new debt obligations and $50 billion in new liquid money. The debt is real. The money is real. Both were manufactured simultaneously through nothing but the auction mechanism and the belief that the U.S. government will keep its word. This isn't a one-off event. It's constant. In the final quarter of 2024, the Treasury expected to borrow $546 billion in new debt. In the first quarter of 2025, another $823 billion. Each auction repeats the same cycle, creating debt instruments from thin air, selling them to investors, and turning investor payments into government spending power. The scale is staggering. Since 2014, total federal debt has doubled, from less than $18 trillion to more than $35 trillion. That means in just 10 years, the government manufactured $17 trillion in new debt instruments and $17 trillion in new spending capacity. Every dollar of debt created became a dollar of government purchasing power. But Treasury auctions are only the first layer. The Federal Reserve adds another dimension to this money and debt factory through something called quantitative easing. When the Fed wants to inject liquidity into the financial system, it doesn't print physical cash and hand it out. Instead, it creates new bank reserves electronically and uses those reserves to buy Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities from financial institutions. Between 2020 and 2022, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from $4 trillion to $9 trillion. $5 trillion in new reserves created digitally, used to buy bonds from banks and investment firms. When the Fed buys a Treasury bond from a bank, it credits the bank's account with newly created reserves while taking ownership of the bond. The bank gains liquid capital to lend, while the Fed gains interest-bearing assets. This process amplifies the cycle. The Treasury issues bonds, creating debt and spending money. Investors buy the bonds, receiving interest-bearing assets. The Federal Reserve then buys many of those bonds from banks, paying with newly created reserves that become lending capacity. Each link in the chain creates more money while adding more debt. The Treasury creates debt to fund spending. The Fed creates reserves to buy that debt. Banks use the reserves to make loans, which creates even more money in the form of credit. And the cycle keeps expanding both money supply and total debt. The most disturbing part isn't the scale or the complexity, it's how few people understand that their own savings and investments are tied directly to this debt manufacturing engine. When you deposit money in a bank, that bank often holds Treasury securities as assets. When your pension fund or 401k grows, it's often because fund managers invest in government bonds. When foreign countries hold dollars as reserves, they store them in Treasury securities. That means the debt the government creates becomes the backbone of private wealth across the entire economy. Your grandmother's savings account is backed by bonds representing government debt. Your insurance company's ability to pay claims depends partly on Treasury securities in its portfolio. Even money market funds advertised as the safest investments are filled with short-term government debt. The feedback loop is unavoidable. The government needs to manufacture debt to keep operating. Investors need safe assets to store wealth. Banks need collateral for lending. Foreign nations need stable reserves. Government debt serves all these purposes at once, creating a self-reinforcing system. The more debt the government issues, the more assets the private sector holds. But this creates a dependency any medieval ruler would envy. The private sector needs the government to keep issuing debt to maintain asset values. The government needs the private sector to keep buying debt to fund spending. Neither side can exit without triggering a crisis that would devastate both. Look at what happens when the machine reverses. In 2022, the Federal Reserve began shrinking its balance sheet, letting bonds mature without replacing them, and selling securities back into the market. This process, called quantitative tightening, pulls money out of the system and reduces the Fed's holdings of government debt. From a peak of nearly $9 trillion, the Fed's balance sheet dropped to about $7.5 trillion by 2024. Every dollar of bonds the Fed lets mature or sells represents money being destroyed, not transferred, not moved, but erased from existence. When a Treasury bond matures and the Fed chooses not to replace it, the Treasury repays the principal, and that money simply disappears. It was created electronically when the Fed bought the bond, and it vanishes electronically when the bond is retired. This reversal reveals the artificial nature of the entire system. Money and debt that seem solid and permanent can be unmade as easily as they were created. The Federal Reserve can expand or shrink the money Supply by trillions merely by adjusting bond buying policies. No gold mined. No cash printed. No physical assets moved. The implications grow even starker when you consider that the system runs purely on confidence. Treasury securities are valuable because people trust the U.S. government will pay its obligations. Bank reserves have purchasing power because financial institutions trust they can convert them into other forms of money. The entire architecture of money and debt creation rests on collective belief in the system's continuity. But belief can collapse. In 2008, confidence in mortgage-backed securities evaporated overnight, freezing credit markets and requiring massive intervention. In 2020, the mere threat of widespread corporate defaults triggered the fastest and largest Federal Reserve response ever recorded. Each crisis exposes how fragile that confidence truly is. Modern monetary theory economists argue that this fragility is mostly an illusion. In their view, a sovereign government that issues its own currency can never run out of money because it can always create more. Government debt, they say, is not really debt in the traditional sense but private sector wealth, denominated in government currency. When the Treasury issues a bond, it's not borrowing so much as creating a financial asset that generates returns. This flips conventional thinking. Instead of government borrowing limiting spending, spending creates the money that makes borrowing possible. Instead of taxes funding government operations, government spending creates the money that allows taxes to be paid. Instead of debt burdening future generations, debt instruments become the foundation of private wealth. Whether you accept this logic or not, the mechanics remain unchanged. Every treasury auction creates new debt instruments while producing new spending power. Every Fed bond purchase creates new bank reserves while expanding the central bank's balance sheet. Every loan made with those reserves creates new money in the form of credit while adding new liabilities for borrowers. The machine you've just seen operates every single day, manufacturing trillions in money and debt with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the force of a financial earthquake. This isn't theory. This is reality. Right now, as you watch this video, Treasury auctions are creating new debt instruments while Federal Reserve systems credit bank accounts with freshly created reserves. The cycle never stops because it cannot stop. Your savings, your investments, your economic future all rely on this perpetual manufacturing process that most Americans never witness and fewer understand. The question isn't whether this system is sustainable. The real question is what happens when the confidence holding it together finally breaks.